Så, men hvis den har
har en sånn der
så fortsatt der, ikke
som henter
kan være så ikke bare en feed før men han er ikke så hvorfor skulle han gå heller enn bra?
Too early or too late? About right? Okay. Just ask him because there's only 1/3 of the class here. But
Isn't that normal?
yeah, it was on and off. Sometimes more, sometimes less. I think there's a strong relationship to the assignment. I don't know. So instead of giving a lecture, I'll probably get off an assignment. The likeliness of you showing up is way higher then, I think. Not you. You guys are the stable ones anyway. So all right, cool. So we need to move on in terms of topics because otherwise we're running out of time. We already realized. And one of the things we haven't talked about is lighting and colors in particular. So how those are modeled in OpenGL. But here more conceptually, how do we deal with lighting in general in the context of rendering scenes independent of OpenGL itself. And I think one of the key things is actually to deal with characteristics of both lights as well as surfaces, because they seem to be more decisive than one would otherwise imagine. So in the context of determining how bright, for example, a color is, all of that. All right. In computer graphics, well, what we're doing, we want to model the real world as realistically as possible, and so it's good to have a bit of a theoretical background of what's actually happening in the real world, right? So we need to understand the effects, and it boils down to, that's pretty much one specific discipline involved, and that's which discipline? Scientific. Sorry? Physics. That's right. And if you look at a subset of physics, can you think of another discipline that's relevant there?
Photons, where you sort of cast the
cool. Yep. So that's a concept, but the whole big field that deals with photons and stuff, or that models its behavior.
Electromagnetic.
All right, someone's pushing it here. So I was more thinking about like optics, simple as that. So very pragmatic, because the idea is that yes, we're dealing with physics, but we're not dealing on atomic level necessarily, but probably more on a more coarse-grained optic level, right? So we are not necessarily interested in a realistic representation of, we're getting closer to that one, that's it, to photons and so on, but actually have a much more coarse-grained perspective as to what happens to a scene if you apply a certain, add a certain light or the like. So, but we get to that in a sec. So, up to now, we looked at surfaces basically just by modeling triangles, but this is more like a pragmatic viewpoint that makes it easier in OpenGL and computer graphics generally, because it's the default way to go. But that's only one element of it. The other element that's important is to think about how we model colors and the lighting that's involved, right? So how do we illuminate a scene, but also the intensity with which certain elements are represented in their colors. So we talked about one way of making a shortcut with respect to representing colors of a surface. What was that one? One approach.
I don't remember its name, but it's when you just replace a 3D model with a texture, and depending on what direction it slips from, you change the... what do you change in the texture? I don't remember. But you change something about the texture to make it look like it's being rendered from a different angle.
Okay. Slipping my mind right now. I was thinking about the magnification, minification effects, so interpolation. But no, that's not actually what that's part of the operation. But textures is the thing I was looking for actually, because texture is basically a shortcut of how to get apply color to a given pixel, right? Without actually dealing with the pixel, because you guys remember that we actually didn't need to deal with color as such when you apply textures to a particular surface, right? You could still concentrate on the vertex shader, not bear with colors, whereas colors seems to be, or is the specialty of the fragment shader, right? So that's where you modify colors, which we actually didn't do, right? So we just injected everything and just bothered with the first bit of the execution. So it's kind of a shortcut of dealing with colors. But here the idea is now, let's not only look at textures, you know, of how an object appears, but rather put it in context with its environment, right? So looking at lighting, viewpoints of the observer and so on, and what impact that has on the final color, whether or not you actually use textures. But that's as far as we got as of now. So as you know from physics and probably philosophy, is that without any light, everything looks black, right? So if there's some sort of light source coming out of from here and from there, probably the entire room would appear completely black. And we basically can only perceive reflections of something as opposed to be able to work without any light influence. So, and one of the key effects here is that the brighter the lights, the brighter the color. So from a reflection point of view, the color is basically a function of the incident light, right? So basically only the light that is reflected is actually visible by us, therefore the color, the intensity of the color depends on the incoming light. So this is relevant for us because it obviously helps us to understand that in OpenGL or in computer graphics more generally, we just need to work on the color intensity to model the intensity of light, right? So especially when we're dealing with reflections of a given surface. And the other thing is the the angle with which the light hits a particular surface, because it affects the brightness, perceived brightness of that surface. Does that make sense? Intuitively? See if I have some. So, and it fundamentally boils down to the idea that different materials obviously have different properties. But looking at my figure back that I put in the beginning, if you have a perfectly reflecting material such as perfect is relative, a perfect surface would be the term here. But what is a good approximation of a perfect surface in terms of reflection? Mirror, right? So yeah, on an optical level it's considered perfect, on a toric level not, which is not relevant for us. So, and the idea is that the incident angle is the emitting angle, basically, right? We have the same reflection, and the idea is there from a viewer's perspective, whether you are standing here, for example, this is the camera or the eye or you name it, as opposed to here. Will leave us with vastly different perceptions of the intensity of the emitted light from that particular location here, right? Because in one case it's directly facing us, right? So the reflection is hitting our eye directly, so it appears brighter than it would be in that particular case, right? Cool? Makes sense? Yeah. So it boils down not only to the intensity of the light, but also the incident angle. And obviously the material, the underlying material, that is actually more decisive than pretty much anything else, at least as far as I get the current development, because that's the key challenge in computer graphics, how to model material, right? So that's all its properties with respect to optics in particular. Cool. Another thing, which is also another topic, which we're not covering today, is shadows, right? So whereas we constantly, or when we think about lighting, we primarily think about direct lighting, right? So, or perhaps one bounce, meaning one reflection or whatever else. But in fact, most of what we see is actually indirect lighting, right? So in fact, this entire part of this room doesn't probably receive any direct lighting from outside there, right? So it's all indirect lighting that's bouncing off and actually eventually illuminating your area down there, right? And there's so many rays coming in that it illuminates the tables from the bottom, from top, and whatever else. And the only difference is basically the brightness, right? So you guys are a bit darker here, those guys are a bit more illuminated, if you like, right? But this is the tricky bit, actually modeling the indirect light, as we'll see later on, in terms of talking about global illumination, not just focusing on a particular object, but on something like a room in its entirety, right? The complexity involved. Because if you were only looking at direct light, it would be very simple, right? So you model a direct incoming light, you model its reflection, and yeah, eventually it hits the wall and that should be over. But it's actually much more complex in terms of intersection of rays and the effects that they have then on the materials they bounce off from. Yes. So another aspect is the light itself. Its color, for example, can affect the the color of the surface, right? So you guys know that you have the notion of color bleeding. If you, for example, have a red light and you put it in a white room, you will perceive the entire room as red, for example, or as blue, right? So, or for example, if I were to remove the slide sets here and have this blue background desktop screen, the entire area here kind of looks bluish, for example, right? So it affects the resulting color and intensity as well. So it's also worthwhile knowing. Without going into physics too deep, because you probably don't need to really for that purpose, is that there are different light models that we're dealing with, or at least different lights that are generated and are used in everyday situations. The natural light seems to be the most comprehensive in terms of covering all wavelengths, including covering the widest range of wavelengths that we see. And that's generally considered white light, and that's typically produced by the sun, for example, right? If it's visible at some stage. But what we're dealing with on a more daily basis are lights that are either man-made in a way, and that could be fluorescent lights which only operate at certain wavelengths, so they don't cover the entire color spectrum. But the advantage there is that the energy consumption to produce such a light is way lower. The idea is basically there that fluorescent material only operates at given wavelengths, and it's much cheaper to selectively activate those ones than covering the entire wavelength spectrum. And we have we're still kind of perceiving it as white light, so humans are not particularly good at differentiating different wavelengths in a too fine-grained manner. So this rather coarse-grained spread of wavelengths is sufficient. Yes, please.
So usually, so far I've been, when I pick colors, programming, I just pick one color. And so if you're gonna pick many colors like this, you're just adding them together.
We come to that in a second. This is just the natural light perspective, or artificial light. How they're added together, we can get to that in the next slide, because just to clear that. Incandescence. Anyone? Do you guys talk about this somewhere? It's also an artificial light, but you notice that the spread across wavelengths is much more, balanced, right, compared to fluorescent light, but not as comprehensive as the case with white light. So particularly the higher range is above are not really illuminated, but any incandescence? That's basically white light emitted by electromagnetic radiation. So if you think, for example, you're heating up metal, very hot, so it actually eventually turns white, right? So you guys know that intuition, right? So it starts to glow, and this is incandescent light, basically. Incandescent stands for white glow, and it's basically the visible light that's emitted by some sort of hot body that's glowing, right? So this, for example, an example. What is that? We don't have them anymore, but you still know them from your childhood.
Light bulb.
Exactly, right? So this is the light bulb. The same effect. Incandescence, you're heating it up enough, so it actually, it illuminates, and then it covers that spectrum. But it's fundamentally artificial light. Cool. So, right. Coming to the human perception. So that was the production side. Where's light coming from? Natural light, sun, and then fluorescent light and so on, whatever we have in our environment. But obviously some sensor needs to perceive it and actually give us the necessary information, right, in order to be able to process it. And natural equivalent to a sensor, in our case, is the human eye, right? So, and human eyes have are fundamentally differentiated into three elements basically, but the two most relevant being the rod and cone photoreceptors, whereas rods only perceive brightness, so they are scattered throughout the fovea and actually just perceive brightness levels. That's their own purpose. And they are much more densely populated in the outer areas of the eye. So if you, for example, are going out at night, you see much more through your, how do you say it?
Peripheral vision?
That's right, peripheral vision, than you do through your central vision, right? So that's because the density of rods is way higher there. On the other hand, at night, you struggle to see colors in the first place, right? So actually, then your cones will hardly have any purpose other than you would just operate based on light, right? So the eye has those two modes basically that are kind of used collaboratively in a way. In the meantime, they figured out there's a third type of photoreceptor, which is basically associated with the idea that it activates your, it operates with your circadian rhythm, basically it controls your sleep cycle, right? If you perceive light, you get the activation mechanism to actually wake up. And that's this third ganglia, I forgot the detailed name, that's the third form of photoreceptor, but it's not involved in the actual viewing, in the actual seeing process, so we can ignore that for our purpose here. And the idea is here that the different rods operate at different wavelengths, right? So 420 nanometer is the mean of the blue cones, and the respective higher ones over here. So, for example, if you look at the light spectrum and you're breaking it down based using prisms of the light, you find that those ones are fairly close together. So if you have a light reflection, you may have this what's called the chromatic aberration. So where the light splits up into different its different color components, right? And that's much more visible for, or earlier visible for red and green because the wavelengths are fairly close together. So it's easy to confuse them there. But basically that's the key idea. So that the human eye perceives across those levels, and the mix of those rods and the perception creates what we see as colors, right? So yellow is the combination of green and red, and then blue has its own representation, and we get to the very low wavelengths, we can perceive violet as well. So, which is involves the the lower range of the perceivable range. But anyway, this model obviously motivates something. Which color model is that fundamentally a foundation for this concept of the human eye? RGB, right? So that's where it's coming from. So because that's how our perception works. So why not model how things are displayed using the model we actually using to see? So meaning we have the equivalent concept, right? So that's the key idea. And that is the prevalent model for modeling light sources in particular. So if things like projectors, LCDs, and so on, all produce light, and the way they do it is by combining those individual light components that we see, RGB, to produce any sort of shade of light, right? So additive here means by adding those light elements together, you ultimately end up at a white color, and of course, having subsets of it allows you to produce yellow or violet shades, or how do you call that color?
Cyan.
Cyan colors, that's right. So that's right. So you can produce those shades as well. And in contrast to that one, when you're modeling not the light sources but surfaces, so the opposite, like that one here, the idea is that, or paper in particular, that you're working in a subtractive mode. So by adding colors, so you're using the intersections of those colors in the RGB model as a basis, and you are able to model cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, right? So yes, so basically adding them together, that's used in the context of printing, and here it's more about looking what the surface absorbs and what it reflects. That's the key idea. Yeah? So so for example, by using red, we can absorb green and blue components here, so to arrive at a blackish surface. You'll also notice that the surface actually kind of interacts with the rate as well. If you look at the rate that I have on my screen here, it actually is, I would be tempted to turn around my monitor, I probably don't do it. It actually looks reasonably bright, but if you look at the rate here, you see already how it interacts with the surface and becomes rather dull-ish. Not sure if you share that perception. So sometimes, especially if you get very yellowish surfaces, projecting surfaces, and people use red color, they nearly look black actually, right, on screen. So if you have seen that effect, it's quite common. But this is basically already the interaction of the surface with the actual emitting color. But bear that in mind for your presentations. If you use red on, it may appear sometimes more like a black. So I always warn my students of that one because it can look pretty dull. But those are two models, right? So one of them is for producing light. This one is for modeling surfaces. Printing is one of those cases, right? So where you have a subtractive way of modeling colors.
Could you also think about it like the one, top one is like you start with a black surface, and then you add colors to the other. You start with a white surface.
That's right. Yes.
So.
Yeah, that's yeah. Yes, exactly. So that's right. Good point. Anyway, so is it super relevant for us? Well, we stay in the upper case mostly, right? So, but when we're modeling surfaces, we actually come back to that as well. Now, okay, so now we have some of that physics background and the intuitions that underlie it, and color models, which you all know already from first year, I assume, or from high school. But one of the other aspects is, okay, how do we actually do the rendering? And the question there being, is there a magic formula that allows us to model all that? So model imminent light, model the wavelength, meaning the color of the light, the angle, the direction it comes in from, then the surface and its reflection, and what's the resulting component that's coming out of it. And the answer is, well, there's such a kind of approach, and the other thing it takes into account is also the perspective of the observer, and it's called the rendering equation. I'm not sure if you have come across that. Some of you who did graphics probably saw that thing, and I intentionally call it a thing because it looks like this. So so it's plenty. if you want to summarize it, plenty. That's pretty good. I like that one. But the idea is fundamentally relatively straightforward. So to model the, I annotated a bit so it's more comprehensible for myself anyway. So if you want to model a light output at a given point, at a given angle on a given surface, that's the thing you need to basically calculate. And fundamentally, X represents the location in space, meaning the position, right? So a particular point. W is, yep.
Could that be then X, Y, Z? Or X is the combination of X, Y, Z?
How do you arrive at X, Y, Z here? Y, Z, Y standing for?
Coordinate system. You said X was the position in the space.
All right, no. X is basically a complete representation of the coordinate in the space, right? So that
all the coordinates.
That would be all the coordinate components.
So it's actually
a point in space.
6 parameters instead of 3. Yeah, never mind.
Yes, okay. So I take that. Yes, that's right. On a surface, though, right? So yeah, that's right. So we only model position. So X, Y, Z. Am I missing something?
I meant Z.
That's right. So those are the 3 we need. So it's a component consisting out of 3 elements. Okay, we can next time rewrite this thing and put this in for the sake of. But the point is, most of them are actually yet another contraction of the individual components. So it's a bit more complex than that. W is the angle of the the angle here. So the angle at which the light is emitted, right, as a result of that calculation. Lambda stands for the light intensity in this case. Or no, rather, the wavelength of the light, sorry for that. Wavelength of the light. And T for time. Yes, so T is factored in, so you can model shifting intensity, line intensity over time. So that's the key idea here. So, but this is the formula for only one point in space, right? So if you actually want to model this entire room, you need to apply it to every, well, modeled coordinate in space. Yeah. You can imagine it can be kind of cumbersome in a way. But what are the components? Yeah.
How do you split that up? Because a surface consists of polygons. So say the wall behind you is just 2 triangles. How would you split that up? And is that a resolution you defined in like rendering configuration?
That's yes. Yeah. Good. Okay. That's a good. Very good point. Very good point. So at this stage, we need to move from probably. I didn't link that to OpenGL yet, but the idea is at this stage we need to move away from the vertex shader and look at the fragment shader. If you recall that the vertex shader is actually modeling the primitives like, you know, triangles and quads and whatever else, all the magic that you guys did, right? So in the recent assignment. Whereas the fragment shader, what does that one actually do? Does anyone remember?
Color. Yeah, color gradients.
So it works on color per pixel, right? So it doesn't work on, you know, the vertex level anymore and using any geometric conception, but just on pixel level. And that's precisely where we are here. Now, that's fragment shader stuff, where it basically iterates through each individual pixel and changes its color depending on incident light, angle, surface characteristics, blah, blah, blah. So think of fragment shader now and think pixel level already. But the second question you mentioned is, so how do we model this one then, right? So yes, it boils down to your resolution, right? So you can imagine that this explains performance issues if you increase the resolution, that because in theory, because it's actually not really done, we will get to that in a second, you need to calculate that for each coordinate that you model in your, in your world in a wider sense, in a visible part of your world anyway. So tedious, no, expensive, I would say, yep.
Is this what they would call like full ray tracing or something?
Ray tracing is a way to approximate precisely that.
Okay.
So there's currently there's no method that comprehensively uses that function because it's too expensive to calculate. But there's a lot of shortcomings in particular in offline rendering. Ray tracing is one of them. We get to that. That approximate this function. It's all about, this is the ideal function, theoretical function. How do we get as close as possible to modeling that thing? Because this has all the components we need to model to get a realistic perception of the environment.
But if you do real-time ray tracing, that would be like the thing.
It would be, it considers most of the aspects, yes, that's right. We get the ray tracing does basically all of this, but it has some shortcomings when it comes to material modeling. Yeah. I'll come to that in a second because it's an application in this context.
Does this add for like balancing of light? So if it bounces off the surface and then hits the eye after like 4 bounces?
Right. No, it models it only for a particular point. If you want to do bouncing, you need to model that. You basically need to follow the light ray and apply that formula again. That's again another application that's called photon mapping. We get into that as well, and ray tracing is similar in a sense as well. Both of them. Here it's really on the, let's say, most atomic level of rendering, if you like. It really looks at one pixel and just see how the reflection goes from there. Whatever happens here is a different problem, right? So where that light goes, it may hit another surface and bounce off again. Then again, you need to apply the same formula again. And that's where it comes complex, because obviously you may need to apply this formula multiple times, right? So you have a direct incident of light to a particular position and a reflection, and then indirect because it's bouncing off another surface, and that may influence the produced light at this particular surface. Good points. Yep.
What was lambda?
Lambda was the wavelength, so meaning the color of the light. But we're not done yet. So, okay, what are the components? One of them is the emitted light. This one is, so the idea is what's the light is coming, that's reflected in this direction. And it's the, this one is the emitted light of the surface itself. So that may be, no light. I mean, it could just be bouncing off a particular surface, but it could also be a lamp or fluorescent light in itself, meaning the whole surface itself would also be a light source, right? So that's one component of the lights. The second one is the bidirectional reflectance distribution function. There you go. We get to that one in a second. This is the core piece here in terms of reflection. And this just determines how much of the light that's actually coming in is reflected towards the outgoing angle, right? So how much is dispersed along the pathway. Again, we had the mirror case where pretty much all of it, most of it is reflected in the at the same angle as the incident light. We'll talk about surface normals in a second. But you may have other surfaces where it's not the case, right? So we get to that in a second because we look at that formula in more detail. The third component then is the actual incoming light. Surprise, surprise. Eventually you need to get that thing as well. That's this one here. So for a particular position, incoming angle, wavelength, and time. And the last bit is the incident angle attenuation. And that reflects in how far the brightness of light based on the distance to the light source. Because the idea is that the further you're away from a light source, the more decay in brightness you will perceive. And if all those components are considered, you should be, no, that's the theoretical optimal model to model light in a particular, for a particular point, right? But you guys now highlighted, okay, well, in the end, I mean, let's you know, leave it at that for now. So it's kind of complicated-ish, and worse than complicated. Complicated is okay. It's expensive to calculate for each point, right? And especially if you have secondary effects like bouncing off of reflection and so on. But this is fundamentally what it's all about. It's more important than this. It's really about bearing the components in mind. So intensity of incoming light, color of incoming light, angle, incoming angle, outgoing angle. Surface characteristics are important as well. So it boils down to material characteristics, but also whether it actually emits light on its own, for example. That's more the lesson to take away from it. What's all influencing? What are the, you know, the independent variables when modeling light, if you want. So, looking at the BRDF, there you go. Bidirectional reflectance distribution function. There you go. The idea is, it just highlights how light is reflected at different angles for an opaque, meaning a non-transparent or non-transmissive surface, right? So it's just reflected off. And this is basically most of the fundamentals which you have learned in physics, but the most important bit is that the incident angle of particular light is the emitted angle, you know, is equivalent to the emitted angle relative to the normal of the surface. And the normal of the surface is basically it sits towards the right angle on a given position to the surface, right? So if you have a somewhat crooked surface or uneven surface, which is more realistic anyway, so this is an idealized surface. So that's more my surface. Right, so if you have an incident light here, you may have a surface normal that's perpendicular to the surface position where the actual incoming light actually hits the surface. But obviously you have various surface normals, such as this one here. So if there's also light reflecting here, then the reflectance of the light will actually point in this direction. Here in this particular case, the emitting light will point in this direction, and so on. So you get, based on the unevenness of the surface, you get different forms of reflection. But the fundamental thing is that the incident angle is the same as the exiting angle. So, and that's why we experience a scattering of light based on the unevenness of the surfaces that we're dealing with. Another example is here, where the surface normal is actually here. And if we have light coming in here, it's probably even coming out here. So suddenly we realize, even though the primary light source is here, based on the surface, we may have reflections in pretty much all directions. And that's realistically what happens anyway. The only difference is that the dominant fraction, or the majority of the light that's actually reflected, will be will depend on the intensity of the incoming light at a particular surface point. For example, this one here may actually be the brightest one, right? So this will be pretty much capturing most of the light, but in principle, any incoming light will realistically illuminate the entire scene based on nearly random reflections. So from our point of view, given our expressions that we're dealing with, we can consider it nearly random, because a surface will never be perfect like this one. Yeah. The other extreme is actually, so apart from this surface, is the idea of what's called a Lambertian surface. And here, that's the opposite of this one here. Here we have a perfect mirror, for example, a perfect surface. And the Lambertian surface case has the perfect dispersion or diffusion of the incoming light. So again here, incoming light with intensity and angle on surface, good. But the spread or the perception of brightness is pretty much even, irrespective of the viewer's point. So that's a different form of, so you see how important the surface actually can be. Examples for this one are matte surfaces, right? It's supposed to be bright kind of thing. That independent of the incident light angle, you are perceived pretty much uniformly bright. That's an ideal case. It's obviously not the case. There's always a bias towards the, this direction here. But overall, it will be perceived brighter. An example is, does anyone have an example in mind? Chalk is one of those. So if you use white chalk and you expose it to light, it pretty much seems equally bright from all perspectives. So it doesn't really matter from where the light source is exactly coming from, but it's nearly evenly dispersed. Yeah. So that's the other extreme form. Mirror, Lambertian surface.
How do you? Okay, there.
Yes, is the name. Lambert. Lambertian surface. Cool. It's the other extreme. So it's perfect diffusion. It's just about spreading light, right? So, but this fundamental formula is the key here, and you guys know that from physics roughly, probably. And based on this idea, you just need to look at the surface to identify where the reflections actually, in which directions they actually, are diffuse, right? Cool. Another aspect that obviously. This was modeling, all right, this was modeling the opaque surfaces, right? So it's non-transparent surfaces, yeah? So it's basically all the light is bouncing off into whatever directions, but it's all bouncing off. By the way, I'm not sure if it's visible on the screen, so I'll probably turn that a bit. So let's get a bit of that as well. You guys probably caught the essence. I think we'll revisit some of that later on as well. So, but the other aspects that we need to deal with when we have a surface, it may not necessarily be opaque, right? So we have reflection, that's cool, we can do that. BRDF. It may be absorbed. It may also be done by an opaque surface, black surface in particular, right? So again, we're modeling absorption, meaning the surface absorbs the energy and generally heats up as a response to that, as a result of that. Dark surfaces. But the messy bit is here. When we have some sort of transmission, when the surface itself actually is somewhat translucent in a way, allows the penetration by light, for example, right? So the light can pass the surface. And that's generally the concept of reflection that comes into place, place. So we know that, for example, if we penetrating water, right? Because of the higher density of water, the incoming light rays are actually redirected, and we have this effect of having this break between the lights on the surface and subsurface, and because of the shape of this glass, we also have a magnification effect in addition to that one. So, but this is the tricky bit to model. The other ones, okay, we can capture them with the existing formula here, but this one becomes a bit more challenging. So refraction is one of them. The other one is subsurface scattering. And this is basically a combination of refraction and reflections within a, often soft body in a way. So the example would be like, your hand. If you use the torch and you're illuminating your hand, you see kind of everything bright. But because of the structure, the veins, the bones, and so on, it has a bit of an uneven perception, right? You can perceive various areas that are a bit more dense in terms of bone structure and appear darker as opposed to lighter. What happens there is basically that the light is transmitted into the object and then bounces off inside internal structures, right? Either based on reflection, or if those surfaces themselves are semi-translucent, then there may also be elements of refraction. For example, penetrating from a lighter skin structure, right? The skin tissue basically towards the bone, you may actually perceive a refraction in the bone, even though the bone itself is still translucent. Meaning you can look through the bone, but the actual light has some is refracted in there. Of course, you won't see that generally on the surface, but you have those effects as shown here, for example, that there are areas that appear darker and lighter, yeah. So, but you may actually perceive structure inside that as well, based on this operation. So that's the complex bit. So basically, you do all that stuff inside the body as well, right? So including reflection and refractions, and then sum them up to receive the final result. So that's kind of the black magic approach to rendering, because no one models that. Everyone approximates that, because it's simply too expensive to do that. So you model the bouncing of light within a given object, right? Yep.
I imagine it's still being done in like renders that can take 5 minutes to render a single frame, and that's fine.
Yeah, more like hours in terms of rendering, but you're right. But even then, they tend to approximate this. We see that in a second, because in the end, the details of that one in the scene are probably not as, unless it's focus of the scene, I get it. But if it's like a object in the scene, right? So it's probably not as decisive as compared to this getting the scene right in the first place, right? So because the number of reflections, L, not R, L, that are happening inside are by magnitude higher in this one, especially since it also has a lot of uneven surfaces than it is in our conceptually idealized environment, right? We have a square room, we can assume nearly perfect surfaces, so that's all a lot easier to calculate than in that kind of body here, right? So the question is, what can you actually gain from it? Because if you just look at it, you could just think, okay, if I know the object, if I know the density of the object, can I approximate the luminosity in different areas, right? So we see that here, that in this brain area, for example, you apply some function to make it darker, and here, surprise, surprise, you make it lighter somehow, right? But it doesn't require me to model each of the interactions of the rays, right? So you can just look at the material perspective and then approximate from there. Does that make sense? But we get to that because that's precisely the problem that we're facing. Yeah, you guys are, as usual, faster than me, because what's the possible problems for games? You highlighted it already. Time, right? We don't have enough time. Such a pity, right? You need to get used to fewer frames per second. Let's say 0.001 frame per second.
No,
so
we don't have that 60 frames per second. The game is unplayable.
All right, okay. You're on that side of the fence. Okay, I think, okay, I lost you here then. So, but this is precisely a problem, right? So how do we model something so it's reasonably acceptable? It's a trade-off of performance and quality as usual, right? So now we look first at quality, so we get a perception what are the techniques that are out there to actually do rendering. So don't consider processing too much, we get there. And then we see how we actually do it in OpenGL, the shortcuts we take. Yeah, just painting the full picture, and then we break it down incrementally, because even offline rendering doesn't allow you to model this whole complexity, the rendering function, in its entirety. And a few of the techniques that I use are ray tracing. And the idea is that's one of the oldest techniques around anyway. And the idea is that you look at the scene that you're modeling, you're firing a ray from that very image plane back into the scene, and basically follow or model all the reflections that would happen on the objects that are in the scene, right? So, basically you follow the reflections, and eventually either you have a hard timeout, which is really the case, but actually eventually it bounces off a surface that's no longer visible in your image, and therefore it's not going to be rendered. But each of those locations at which the light, or this ray rather, hits the surface is then kept track of in terms of color, luminosity, and so on. The problem with ray tracing is that it actually has always hard shadows. So it's not good for modeling soft shadows or specifically modeling translucent materials. So it doesn't actually work quite well with this one. So it will rather, it's okay, it's good at producing reflections, but not good at modeling rich material characteristics. And it can't really model what's called caustics. That's right. So if you, right, that could work. Let's try that. So see, yeah, that's one. So if you look at here, you have those secondary effects So you see elements of, no, you don't see elements of refraction, but that would be classical glasses behavior, right? So it's minifies or magnifies something. But you may have also secondary effects that you can see on a reflected surface. And those are called glaucoustics. You have them if you, for example, have a wine glass and illuminating from the side, you see a shadow of the wine glass, but inside the shadow you have optic reflect effects as well. Right? So it's basically like a refraction in the shadow, if you like, but not the reflection on the object itself. That's fine, easy to model. But the modeling the reflection in the shadow is not something that ray tracing can deal with, because it stops operating basically on the object level, but doesn't think about the shadow after that further. But this is where other techniques are better at doing. So the photon mapping is kind of the opposite. It starts off the light source, right? So it starts off the light source and emits its rays from there through the scene, and then just looks where the photon where the photons land on the scene, and just uses that one to basically model the entire scene. But it can consider via a secondary process. So basically the idea is that, or in a bit more detail, so you send a photon from the light source, you model all intersections of a material with the light. Then you need to know material characteristics. If you model a scene, for example, you have glass in there, you need to know properties of glass. You need to know the three components, which is either whether it absorbs entirely, that would be a solid cube, whatever else, right? So black surface, for example, whether it reflects or whether it actually has transmissive effects. And this is specified in a probabilistic manner. So you said with a probability of 0.5, this surface will reflect, 0.25, for example, will absorb, and the remainder would be reflection and so on. So, and then the algorithm is basically doing a Russian roulette around with those probability distribution, and then determine, okay, in this particular position, the surface will now refract. Next time it most likely will be reflecting, because that's the dominant probability. So basically each photon is fired as a given object, and the object properties determine what happens next. Yeah. So it's actually modeling with the material. That's the key idea here. And in the second step, all this. All right, cool. So now, if a refraction, for example, is happening through an object, then the photon moves further to the next surface and so on, right? So the process continues there, and all the intersections of surface and photons with respect to luminosity and position, obviously, are kept track of in a photon map. And then in the second stage, a rendering mechanism is going over the entire photon map and bringing together all the individual information for all the individual points and generating a global picture from it, right? So in the first photon hitting the immediate surface will produce some sort of luminosity, but there may be a reflection coming later on from another photon fired at the scene, and this will be kept separately until we come to the rendering stage when it's integrated and to calculate the final level of brightness or whatever else for a particular point in space. Does it make sense? It's kind of a two-pass algorithm. So first, we model the lighting characteristics for all intersections with a given material, and since one photon or different photons may actually hit the same pixel directly or indirectly, we need to integrate this information eventually, right? So first, for model photon, we keep track of all the brightness information. Second one, we keep track of all the brightness information. Third one, keep track of all the brightness information. And at the second stage, we need to move that, shift it all together, and then finally identify the final luminosity, for example, for each of the pixels, right? That may be affected through any of those previous stages, right? It's just an integrative process. The essence there is that it's just incredibly expensive to do it. Yep.
But this just handles brightness in a more natural way. It doesn't actually handle the reflections?
It does handle reflections. So the idea is that you model material here as well. So you provide this tool a probability of three characteristics about this surface. So a probability of its doing reflection, a probability of absorbing, probability of refraction or transmission. So, and then you attach certain values. So this one is probably, let's say 0.5 in terms of reflection, right? Because it's fairly bright, and it absorbs, you know, some of the. No, I don't think there's any reflection here. So, yeah, so it probably would be 75% reflection and 25% absorption in terms of material. So, whenever the light, So when a light ray, a photon hits this particular surface, right? We play Russian roulette. Basically, randomly pick across weighted probabilities. So most likely, in 75% of all incidents of lights or photons hitting the surface, we'll get the idea that it will reflect. So it will actually apply the reflection formula that we know. Incident angle equals emitted angle, right, over the normal, meaning the perpendicular direction of the surface. So meaning if the light coming from here, it will reflect. If it's absorption, we model the incoming light, capture luminosity, but it may actually just be absorbed, so meaning the photon is done, so it's no further operation in this particular case, right?
Do you then just store the color of, like, after that point where the photon hit, and then afterwards do ray tracing to figure out what that color is supposed to be on the screen? So you capture the intensity, the wavelength. So yes, and now in this, not ray tracing, but in the ray tracing, yes, that's right. So in the second stage, that describes the second stage. You go over all the color information that you collected, because this position may have been hit by multiple photons, right? So we may have multiple information, and that's the idea here, to integrate all this information coherently across the entire scene. So we have a global illumination model as opposed to a local point-based illumination model. That's the only process. Then basically does in 2 steps the whole operation. But yes, you're fundamentally right. Yes. Okay.
So it's just combining the information that you get. Key difference here is we actually model material, and we're emitting from the light source, not from the viewer's perspective. So you're retracing how the light actually, or seemingly how the light actually spreads in the environment. Is that visible? Yeah, somewhat. Does anyone see any differences here?
Yeah.
So what's probably what of the 2 methods we talked about? I didn't make it terribly hard, admittedly, but
the left one is just ray tracing. Yeah. The shadows are really hard.
Yeah.
And very little light is reflected, if any.
Yeah.
Light is reflected, but little.
That's right. So this is classical ray tracing, solid shadows. It looks good at first sight, but actually on second sight, if you think that's actually marbles, it's kind of a bit unrealistic. It's because it doesn't model the optical effects, the second order optical effects. And also, because of that second iteration of the photon mapping process, it considers the multiple incidents of light for a given surface position. What you have here is, you have a bit of, I'm not sure if it's visible, a bit of color bleeding, if you like. So if you look particularly in this corner here, that's just the harsh surface, and there's some softening approach here that makes it a bit softer, the shadow. But if you look here, you actually see a reddish discoloration here, right? So which is kind of realistic, that you have a bit of what's called color bleeding from the left wall here. That's moving into the picture based on reflections that have been emitted by that surface, right? Or bounce off that surface, rather. And the other thing that you see is that's what I tried to highlight earlier, the caustics, right? The secondary effects of refraction in a shadow, if you like. Yeah, not the reflection itself, that's cool, both can do that. But the effect here, that you have this brightness effect that you just saw with my glasses as well, right? So, and this is only, you can only model that using photon mapping, or you can't model it using ray tracing, but you can, for example, use photon mapping to actually do that. Okay. So different techniques for different purposes. Overall, the scene feels much more, less dark, I guess, right? Here's really stark in terms of contrasts, and that's much softer, probably more realistic way of modeling a scene, right? So I would imagine if you do ray tracing, this corner here over there would be much darker than it actually is in reality, the way I perceive it from here. So in addition to those ones, there's obviously more to that one. we also have one that's particularly hot right now, and that's path tracing. And the idea is there that it's kind of a brute force method. That it's not so much modeling the focuses on accurate modeling of each individual pixel based on incoming photons, but you just brute force by having many rays coming from the approximate light or light direction onto that particular pixel, and then just follow that ray for a specified number of bounds. Bit Mike, yeah, sorry.
I'm going to have a break soon.
Oh, I'm very sorry. I'm very immersed in my thing here. Yeah, I'm sorry. 10 minutes. Works that? Yeah, 11:25. Thanks for a reminder. Sometimes I get a bit consumed by my own talking. Sorry for that.